Hester and Her Needle is chapter 5. I'm just going to warn you that this chapter can be a little overwhelming. Not a lot happens, but there is a really deep dive here into what is the impact of sin. I could imagine there being a lot of evidence coming from this chapter if you had to write a paper about, the impact of what Hester has done or what the story is saying about sin in general. How sin of one person affects other people. There's just a tremendous amount here that it can be challenging to read, but I'm gonna try and take you through it so that you catch all the important things. So what happens at the beginning is she is released from prison. Her confinement is finally over, and she's feeling horrible. And I think we can also assume that one reason she's feeling horrible, besides the fact that she is a single mother and she has to wear this scarlet letter on her dress at all times, is that she knows her husband is in town and that she has to keep his secret, and that maybe she doesn't trust him and he's kind of creepy. So there are a lot of things going through her head that I'm sure make her feel very fragile. So she's trying here to pull up the strength that she has. I think we can assume that Hester is a strong woman of character. Even though she's a sinner, she definitely seems to me, at least at this point, like a woman with some character. She's well dressed, not that that means she has character, but she seems to be a little bit more sophisticated than the typical Puritan. She clearly has passions of the heart. She came to Massachusetts by herself. She waited 2 years for her husband, who never showed up. We also know she married a man she didn't love to get out of her poverty in England. So she has some strength, I would definitely say. And so she is supported by an unnatural tension of the nerves and by all the combative energy of her character, which enabled her to convert the scene into a kind of lurid triumph. So as she walks out of this prison, all the people in town are there to stare at her. None of the magistrates, no one from the government is walking with her. She's entirely by herself. And even though she's feeling very fragile, she manages to be strong and feel somewhat triumphant, which is ironic. She realizes that she might call up the vital strength that would have sufficed for many quiet years. Like, she's going to need to be strong for a very long time. The very law that condemned her, a giant of stern features, but with vigor to support as well as to annihilate in his iron arm, held her up through the terrible ordeal of her ignominy, referring here to the Puritan law. But now, with this unattached walk from her prison door, began the daily custom, and she must either sustain and carry it forward by the ordinary resources of her nature or sink beneath it. So she only has herself to rely on. It's like she's realizing, like, this is my everyday reality. I have to be strong every single minute. Every day would be a challenge, is what it says at the end of that page. She thinks about that in many ways she is no longer an individual. Giving up her individuality, she would become the general symbol at which the preacher and moralist might point, and in which they might vivify and embody their images of woman's frailty and sinful passion. So because she has to, even if she wasn't wearing the scarlet letter, everybody knows that she is a sinner, but of course she's wearing it just to remind everybody all the time. So she's no longer an individual. She's actually a sinner. And so people, use her as like a point of reference for what you're not supposed to do. Also as an example of how women are somehow flawed. Thus, the young and the pure would be taught to look at her with the scarlet letter flaming on her breast, at her, the child of honorable parents, at her, the mother of a babe that would hereafter be a woman, and her who had once been innocent, as the figure, the body, the reality of sin. So she came from good people. She's a good person. Her child has potential to be a great person, and yet every single part of her being and her child's is now going to be defined by her sin. It may seem marvelous that with the world before her, kept by no restrictive clause of her condemnation within the limits of Puritan settlement, to leave. I mean, she doesn't have to stay there, apparently. She's not imprisoned by the Puritan community. She could go back to England, or she could go to any other European land, or maybe even another settlement, another place within New England. She could also go out to the forest and live with the Native Americans, who have very different laws and customs. So she is free to go. But what's interesting is she chooses to stay. And I think there's a lot to be discussed here about why does she choose to stay with these people who have condemned her in this way. The chain that bound her here was of iron links and galling to her innermost soul, but could never be broken. And so it's a natural question, why? Why does she choose to stay? Well, I'm thinking on my own here. One reason is because the man who fathered the child is there. Obviously, her lover is there. So that would be one reason. There's a father, a secret father. Also, there might be another feeling that kept her within the scene and pathway that had been so fatal. There dwelt, there trode the feet of one with whom she deemed herself connected. Exactly, the other man. Unrecognized on earth, maybe they would be together in heaven. So even though they could never be together as a couple on earth, maybe if she stays there, somehow they would meet again. That might be one thing she's thinking of. Here, she also believes, had been the scene of her guilt, and here should be the scene of her earthly punishment. And so, perchance, the torture of her daily shame would at length purge her soul. So perhaps if she stays and suffers the penance, maybe she will reach salvation. Maybe she will not be doomed to live with Satan in the afterlife. So she has a lot of reasons here. The other man, the fact that she feels like she should do her duty and suffer the penance. She might meet her lover in heaven one day. She also might just get to heaven one day if she can go through the torture and daily shame that is supposed to be her punishment. So she doesn't leave, but she does go to the outskirts of town. She settles in a small thatched cottage. If you don't know what a thatched cottage is, it's probably a little stone or wood house that has a thatched roof. And a thatched roof is made with like dried grasses and straw, very, very tight and sheared. And it is somewhat, solid, which is amazing to think about. But I mean, there are still thatched cottages in England today that people live in. So they can be strong. This little house is on the shore, looking across a basin of the sea at the forest-covered hills. So it's kind of like on the edge of town, but near the water, looking west. So I feel like this is sort of a hopeful image for some reason. It just seems like, water is often a rebirth. Perhaps in this place, she can go deeper into herself. There are scrubby trees kind of described here. And it talks about the fact that children sneak out to where she lives to spy on her. They want to see her. She's like, ooh, who's this woman? And they go and they spy on her and they see her sewing at the cottage window or standing in the doorway or working in the garden. And then they run away like, ooh, she's scary. Lonely as was Hester's situation without a friend on earth who dared to show himself, she, however, incurred no risk of want. So this is an important thing I started this year. This is how she's going to make money. That's how she's going to take care of herself. She possessed an art, which is needlework. And of course, we got a hint of that with the Scarlet Letter itself, because she sewed it and she embroidered it with the gold thread. So she is really good as a seamstress, but more importantly, as an embroiderer, as someone who can, sort of decorate fabric with beautiful thread and gold and things like that, which seems odd because remember, the Puritans dress in very plain clothes. They don't believe in any sort of ornamentation. And yet it's explained here that there are times when ornamentation in clothing is important. One would be for government officials. If there's any kind of important ceremony, the governor, for instance, needs to have nicer clothes. Perhaps the clergy The minister needs to have like a special collar or a special stole. So there are moments when you do want nicer clothes. Also, funerals. When people are buried, they're often buried in nicer clothes. And babies, children, are dressed in a more elaborate way. So she has enough work. People come to her and ask her to do sewing and more decorative embroidery. So slowly, but she starts to fill a gap that which must otherwise have remained vacant. She has meaningful work. She has something to do, and she has a role in this society. And it talks here about all the different places that you would see, evidence that she had sewn something. So people are not too upset with her, to come and actually have her make them things. What's interesting, though, is that people are still mean to her. They seem to just like, we're going to see examples here where even though they come and they pay her for her work, they still kind of like openly scorn her and make fun of her. I think this is interesting too, and I made a note here that this is a symbol, and I mentioned this once already, that children were distinguished by a fanciful or fantastic ingenuity, which served indeed to heighten the airy charm that early began to develop itself in the little girl, but which appeared to have also a deeper meaning. So remember that she makes clothing for children. Well, she dresses her own child in very elaborate clothes. So this is, she sort of sets her up. Now, what's interesting is that Hester herself, which is described here, wears very plain clothes. She wears the coarsest material, the most somber hue, like she's just wearing gray and brown. She's being very, very subdued, except for the scarlet letter on her dress. But for her daughter, she sews all kinds of really fantastic looking clothes. So here even Hawthorne is saying that this has a deeper meaning. So the child is playful and charming, and her clothes are the same way. Much of the time, which she might readily have applied to the better efforts of her art, she employed in making coarse garments for the poor. So in addition to sewing nicer clothes for important events, she makes clothing for the poor, and she just gives it to them. She's not asking them to pay her. Women derive pleasure incomprehensible to the other sex from the delicate toil of the needle. To Hester, it might have been a mode of expressing and therefore soothing the passion of her life. So she finds a way to sew all the time. So if she doesn't have someone who has hired her to make something, she's making clothing for the poor because it settles her. It sort of taps into her creativity and her talents. And this makes me think how I just recently was reading something about how young people today, this would be our Gen Z generation, are getting into grandma hobbies like knitting and needlepoint and embroidery. And it's because it is calming and it is a very organic, simple act that kind of, obviously it's more satisfying than media would be. She also, like all other joys, she rejected it as sin, which is interesting. This is what makes her feel meaningful, like she's contributing to society and she's taking care of herself. But she even considers the fact that she's enjoying what she does as a sin. This morbid meddling of conscience with the immaterial matter betoked, it is to be feared, no genuine and steadfast penitence, but something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath. Though I think this is an important section to mark. Like, she's restless. She knows that she's more than her sin. She also knows that her talents are legitimate, and yet she feels like she's not supposed to have any joy because she's supposed to be suffering for her mistakes. And so there's a lot of inner conflict and turmoil here. In this manner, Hester came to have a part to perform in the world. With her native energy of character and rare capacity, it could not entirely cast her off, even though it marks her as a sinner, like Cain would have been from the Bible. So it says up here, every gesture, every word, even in the silence of those with whom she came in contact, implied and often expressed that she was banished, and as much alone as if she had inhabited another sphere or communicated with the common nature of by other organs and senses than the rest of humankind. She stood apart from mortal interests, yet close beside them, like a ghost that revisits the familiar fireside. This is a beautiful simile. So she is banished all the time, and yet she is still present. It's a pretty long simile here. To these emotions, in fact, and its bitterest scorn besides, seemed to be the sole portion that she retained in the universal heart. It was not an age of delicacy, and her position, although she understood it well, was in little danger of forgetting it, was often brought before her vivid self-perception like a new anguish, like the rudest touch upon the tenderest spot. So she is continually reminded of what she has done wrong. The poor, as we have already said, whom she sought out to be the objects of her bounty, reviled the hand that was stretched forth to give them the food, like the clothing. So even the poor people looked at her with disgust. There was bitterness that was sent to her every time. Other women, were mean to her, which I wrote along here. Like they would even say mean things to her when she would deliver things that she had made for them. They would say terrible, mean things and just like criticize her for what she has done. She never responded to these attacks, save by a flush of crimson when she would blush, but she would never say anything back. She would just accept those mean comments. She even sometimes found, when she would be brave enough to go to church, that she herself would be the subject of the sermon. Like, don't be like her, she's the sinner. So a lot of public shaming that happened day in and day out. Children would yell at her when she walked through the street. I mean, Hawthorne goes on and on and on about the many, many ways that she is humiliated, even though people are, letting her stay and contribute to their society through her craft. Another peculiar torture was felt in the gaze of a new eye. Like if a stranger came and saw that scarlet letter, they would know that it was a judgment and that she had done something wrong. So every day, again, there's just this daily torture. But sometimes, here's a tiny little shift. Sometimes she felt an eye, a human eye, upon the ignominious brand that seemed to give a momentary relief, as if half of her agony were shared. So somebody, the father of the child, every now and then looks at her in a way that she feels comfort. She knows that she's not alone. The next instant, back it all rushed again, with still a deeper throb of pain. For in that brief interval, she had sinned anew, because she felt something for that person. And of course, she's not supposed to. So no, Hester had not sinned alone. And so any time she might cross paths with the person she sinned with, she feels guilty all over again because she feels something for that person and she's not supposed to. Her imagination was somewhat affected. Walking to and fro sometimes, she would sort of feel like haunted. She also was able to recognize sin in other people. So this is interesting too. The scarlet letter had endowed her with a new sense. She shuddered to believe it, yet could not help believing that it gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in other hearts. She was terror-stricken by the revelation that were thus made. What were they? Could they be other than the insidious whispers of the bad angel, who would fain have persuaded the struggling woman, as yet only half his victim, that the outward guise of purity was but a lie, and that if truth were everywhere to be shown, a scarlet letter would blaze forth on many a bosom besides Hester Prynne's? So she's afraid that because she can sense sin in other people, that the devil has taken over her, that somehow she is the devil, because only the devil would know the sin. That's kind of what she's thinking. It freaks her out. Or must she receive these intimations, so obscure yet so distinct, as truth? Like, were they actually sinners? In all her miserable experience, there was nothing else so awful and loathsome as this sense. It perplexed as well as shocked her by the irreverent inopportuneness of the occasions that brought it into vivid action. Like, she's like, what the heck? How do I know that that woman I'm passing on the street has done something evil? So we're going to dive into this a little bit. Sometimes the red infamy upon her breast would give a sympathetic throb as she passed near a venerable minister or magistrate, the model of piety and justice, to whom that age of antique reverence looked up as to a mortal man in fellowship with angels. What evil thing is at hand, would Hester say to herself. Lifting her reluctant eyes, there would be nothing human within the scope of view save the form of this earthly saint. So she would pass a person who is known to be a very good person in the community, and she can sense that that person is evil. Again, a mystic sisterhood would contumaciously assert itself as she met the sanctified frown of some matron who, according to the rumor of all tongues, had kept cold snow within her bosom throughout life. So this is quite a word. Contumaciously, you've probably never seen that one before. It means bold, rebellious. So, to boldly assert itself. So she would sometimes, recognize in another woman that they were a cold, evil person. That unsunned snow in the matron's bosom and the burning shame on Hester Prynne's, what had the two in common? Or once more the electric thrill would give her warning, behold, Hester, here is a companion, here is another sinner. And looking up, she would detect the eyes of a young maiden glancing at the scarlet letter, shyly and aside and quickly averted with a faint chill crimson in her cheeks, as if her purity were somewhat sullied by the momentary glance. Like someone can't help but look at her letter and identify with it because perhaps she too has had a lover. Very interesting. So, but it accepted it as a proof that all was not corrupt in this poor victim of her own frailty and man's hard law, that Hester Prynne yet struggled to believe that no fellow mortal was guilty like herself. So she deep down knows that she is not all evil, and that, she is certainly guilty, and so are others. So she's recognizing this, and to me, I would think that would give her comfort, that people recognize themselves in her and that she can perceive it is a way for her to feel not so much alone. And yet I thought it was interesting, which is what I marked at the bottom of this page, that it upsets her so much. It makes her feel like she has evil powers, which, makes her feel even more condemned. The vulgar, who in those dreary old times were always contributing a grotesque horror to what interested their imaginations, had a story about the Scarlet Letter, which we might readily work up into a terrific legend. So people talked about that Scarlet Letter, we can imagine, for years and years and years. And just like anything, any kind of a story that's gossiped about, it changes, it becomes worse. They averred that the symbol was not mere scarlet cloth, tinged in an earthly dye pot, but was red with infernal fire and could be seen glowing all alight whenever Hester Prynne walked abroad in the nighttime. So, the rumor and the gossip about her changes from its fabric to it's like truly burning, and it's lighting up the night. And we must needs say it seared Hester's bosom so deeply that perhaps there was more truth in the rumor than our modern incredulity may be inclined to admit. So this is all about the power of sin. Like, she can never, ever be free of it. She always knows what she did. The way people treat her day in and day out, in some ways, does make it like a burning thing. So this is certainly a chapter I would be marking lots of examples of, what does a Scarlet Letter do to her psychologically? How are people treating her? How is she able to see evil in other people? Why does she choose to stay where she is and do her penance, for this hope of having salvation later? It just shows like how powerful sin is and how it can dominate an individual's daily life.